So as we take a look at Jewish thought on disability, one of the things I want to look at is both representations of disability in the classical texts, as well as to think about some contemporary Jewish voices. If we survey Jewish thought on disability, we find many principles and values that offer a strong voice to affirm the dignity and the vitality of people with disabilities. There is, to name just a few, the biblical command to not insult the deaf, nor put a stumbling block before the blind in Leviticus 19:14, which lays out an explicit obligation to treat people with disabilities with decency and respect. The oft-repeated biblical call to care for the orphan, the widow, and the stranger offers a biblical exhortation to ensure the well-being of those who are most easily marginalized or neglected within our societies. Ethical touchstones from the Jewish tradition call Jews to recognize all people as created, b'tselem Elohim, in the image of God. Jewish sources also offer a vigorous support for the principles of justice and the repair of the world. Tzedek, tzedek tirdof calls Deuteronomy 16, justice, justice, this is what you shall pursue. I speak today from out of two worlds, both as a rabbi, an ethicist, a scholar of classical Jewish texts, and as a disability activist committed to strengthening and supporting the full engagement of people with disabilities in all aspects of life, to resisting the ableism, attitudes, and structural barriers that diminish the well-being of people with disabilities, and to celebrating the integrity, vitality, and tremendous creativity, the resilience of the disability community in all of our diversity. In this talk, I aim to examine a series of lesser-known Jewish texts on disability in light of disability studies principles and activist perspectives. I want to consider how Jewish tradition might help all of us, Jewish or not, grapple with key questions about the place of disability in religious communities and within our religious imagination. I focus primarily on texts drawn from the Babylonian Talmud. The Babylonian Talmud is a 6th century sacred text that is foundational for rabbinic Judaism, and that's really at the heart of so much contemporary Jewish thought and practice. The Babylonian Talmud is perhaps one of the most important set of volumes on the traditional Jewish bookshelf. The Talmud was composed over a series of several centuries. This is a post-biblical text, so it comes after the completion of the Hebrew Bible, the Jewish Bible, also after the completion of the Christian Bible. And it emerges after the destruction of the Second Temple by Rome in 70 CE. So the Talmud in many ways reflects and represents the development of a new form of Jewish practice, a new form of Jewish life, what we call today Rabbinic Judaism. Rabbinic Judaism transformed the biblical religiosity and temple-based practice, which you might know from the Hebrew Bible or from the Christian scriptures, into Judaism as we know it today, a religious and cultural system that is able to adapt to diaspora, that's no longer rooted in sacrifice or temple rituals, that's rooted instead in the practice of mitzvot, the commandments, the daily expressions of ethical acts and religious obligations that aim to create a system that shapes every action, every aspect of ordinary life into an opportunity for serving and honoring God. The Talmud doesn't replace the Bible. The Hebrew Bible remains a core text in Jewish life and practice. What the Talmud does is interpret, develop, expand, engage, and often argue with biblical texts. Its rabbis debate and argue about how to live out biblical ideals, how to adapt them to meet the needs of their own time. In traditional Jewish practice, it's most common to read the Bible through the Talmud, along with later commentaries and interpretations that have continued to develop over the centuries. None of these texts are a closed book or a sealed corpus. The conversation is always alive. It's always ongoing. So as we think about disability and bodily difference in Jewish tradition, I'd like to begin with rabbinic Jewish responses to one of the most prominent and problematic portrayals of disability in the Hebrew Bible. That's Leviticus 26, verses 16 through 23. It's the first passage on your handout, lines 1 through 9, and it's the text that Jeremy spoke about earlier this week. Leviticus 21 is perhaps the most concise formation of the ideal of priestly physical perfection. Since this group has already discussed the biblical text, I don't want to spend much time talking about the Bible today. I'll mention a few pieces of that biblical text that I think are especially relevant for what I want to say, which is to talk about how the later Jewish tradition interprets, grapples with, and thinks about these passages. In the discourse of the biblical priestly writer, the Israelite priests represent physical exemplars of holiness. From their special lineage to their intense ritual requirements, and all of this preoccupation with their physical perfection, these diverse aspects of the temple priesthood were designed to allow just a very few ideal and idealized servants to mediate between God and the rest of us. The priests, in many ways, I think, serve as the visible representatives of God. They, in effect, stand in for the unseen, perfect body of God. The priestly source conceptualizes blemishes, mumim, as conditions that limit or impair a priest's ability to see and be seen before God and community. So as I think about the way the rabbinic texts take these biblical sources and interpret them, I'm particularly interested in the way the narratives amplify the constructed nature of disability. Disability theorists, here I'm thinking particularly of the work of Leonard Davis, emphasize that disability is an unstable and socially created category. What we call disability, what we commonly think of disability, is actually, Davis says, a complex interaction between organic bodily difference and the social meaning of that difference. The experience we call disability, then, involves two interlocking strands. Impairment, that is a certain degree of limitation in one or more areas of daily life, like seeing, hearing, knowing, moving, or feeling. And social attitudes or barriers, that is ableism, that is a cultural system that articulates a certain idea of normalcy, that assumes everyone should fit the mold, that empowers those it considers able at the expense of those it considers disabled. Impairment is the element of disability that I think gets a lot of attention, especially in the medical model of disability, where the person with a disability is primarily seen as a patient or a condition, a problem to be cured. By contrast, many disability theorists and activists assume instead a social or cultural model of disability and consider social factors to be one of the most, if not the most, significant disabling factors. And this is the perspective that I'm really coming out of and that I will speak out of today. While we acknowledge that from this perspective that impairment is often, but not always, but often, a part of disability, we suggest that it is people's attitudes and the social structures and the power relations created by those attitudes that turn impairments into very serious social, cultural, practical liabilities. In other words, there's really nothing wrong with rolling through the world. It's a great way to get around. It's a lovely life. A wheelchair becomes a drag, though, when buildings are built with steps, when you're coming in through the roof. Right? When bathrooms are made too small for reasonable turning, when posh new restaurants insist on bar stool tables, when the whiteboard or the podium rises far above my head. An ableist or disableist culture puts the problem in the wrong place. Right? I'd suggest instead the problem doesn't lie with the wheels, it lies with the built environment, right? With our constructed, created way of being with one another. By contrast, disability activists often emphasize that what culture sees as impairment is actually part of the spectrum of ordinary life, part of natural human diversity and variation, part of the reality of living, of being alive. Sometimes it's a liability, sometimes it's a limitation, sometimes it's a drag, but sometimes it's an asset, a site of creative possibility and power. So as I bring disability studies perspectives to these Talmudic texts, one of the questions I always want to ask is how and why do certain differences become socially significant? How do they become stigmatized? While other differences are considered run-of-the-mill, ordinary, not worth commenting on. Feminist disability theorist Rosemary Garland Thompson suggests that much of the work of stigmatizing bodies works through what she calls the stare. The intrusive gaze of a viewer, which objectifies and thereby often disables the person being stared at. When rabbinic writers think about the biblical texts about disabled priests, when they're thinking about body and difference in their own communities, they're thinking intensely about the power and danger of the stare. So let's take a look at rabbinic texts on disability in the priesthood. Okay? Before we turn to the Talmud, the text I'm actually going to focus most on, we got to look at the Mishnah. The Mishnah is a 2nd century rabbinic text. It's earlier. Right? It's one of the first codes of Jewish law and practice. It's shorter, it's more straightforward than the Talmud, and it aimed to canonize key principles and practices of the emerging rabbinic movement. Okay? So as we read this text, remember, the rabbis are writing after the destruction of the temple in 70 CE. So the sacrificial system is gone. Okay? There's no more priests actually anywhere performing sacrifices. There's no more priests working at an altar. Okay? So on the surface of things, this biblical text, the Leviticus text, is no longer particularly relevant. Okay? But right? The rabbis assumed that the biblical text would never become obsolete, right? that it would always have wisdom and insight to offer. Right? And so they thought about, well, where are there priests? Where are priests active? One of the places where priests are active is in the emerging synagogue. And one of the responsibilities of the priest was to recite the priestly blessing over the congregation, a task which involved raising up their hands in a gesture of blessing. This is actually a gesture of blessing that some of you may recognize from its adaptation in Star Trek. Okay? So it involves a very intricate maneuvering of the hands and the fingers, which I cannot and will not attempt to reproduce for you today. So, Mishnah Megillah 4:7, the second text on your handout, this is lines 10 through 11 if you want to follow along, describes a prohibition on priests with blemished hands. Okay? The Mishnah says, a priest whose hands are blemished may not lift up his hands. Rabbi Yehuda says, also, one whose hands are stained by woad or matter may not lift up his hands because the people might gaze at him. The text here uses the exact same word, blemish, mum, as the Leviticus text. But at this point, the only blemishes that matter, the only relevant mumim we're talking about, are visible on the hands that grant blessing. According to the Mishnah, at least according to Rabbi Yehuda's view, hands that have been stained by woad or matter, that's blue or red dye, also serve as a kind of blemish. Now, this is not exactly a physical bodily disability anymore, at least not the way most of us in this room often think about disability. We're now thinking here about disability as a dyer's problem, disability as a condition of a certain kind of employment. The Mishnah also showcases the problem or the issue of perception in that final line. Why can the priest not lift up his hands? Because people might gaze. So here's the thing about the priestly blessing. You are not supposed to look while it's happening. Even today, priests who are performing the priestly blessing in a traditional synagogue draw their talit, their prayer shawl, over their heads to shield them from people's gaze. Right? It's customary to look down, if you're receiving the blessing, to look down, to look away while the priests are giving the blessing. The priestly blessing in the synagogue is a moment of ritual action where the bodies of the priests, the physical form of the priest, is supposed to be invisible. Right? They are actively supposed to avoid the gaze of everybody else in the galley. The disabled priest is problematic here because he might catch the gaze, the eye of the viewers and cause them to look. Or, I'd like to reframe that a little bit more accurately. He's a problem because the problem is that people's social conceptions of disability might catch them up, right? Might cause them to stare. So in a critical shift, this text locates the problem less in the body of the priest and much more in the eye of the beholder, in the act of staring and stigmatizing the person with a disability. So now let's take a look at the Talmudic discussion of this Mishnah, the third text on your handout, okay, Megillah 24b. In the Talmud, we rarely get a single straightforward opinion. So what we'll see as we look at this text is a series of arguments back and forth between different rabbis that are probing how to understand different aspects of the practice. Okay? So the Talmud begins with a familiar prohibition, echoing and slightly expanding the Mishnah. And then in line 12, one rabbi, Rabbi Yehoshua, says he prohibits a priest who has visible scaling, visible alterations of his skin, to raise his hands in blessing. Right? And the Talmud's anonymous voice agrees in line 14, a priest with curved or crooked hands shall not lift up his hands to bless the people. So far, it's a fairly straightforward recapitulation of some of the things we've already seen in the Mishnah. But just when we think we're headed for a clear enumeration of physical disabilities and how you can't perform the blessing if you have certain bodily limitations, Rav Ashi, another rabbi, extends the prohibition to priests of a particular area. According to Rav Ashi, a priest from Haifa or Beishan isn't allowed to bless. Why? Because, according to Rav Ashi, they mispronounce the blessing. They say the aleph as ayins, the ayins as alephs. Now, we might think this is an issue of speech disability, but remember, Rav Ashi is actually talking about entire towns and regions here. So he's saying, Canadians, no priestly blessing for you, or Bostonians, you're out, off the podium. The next portion of the text devolves into a series of insults between the sages. In line 19, Rabbi Chia turns to Rabbi Shimon bar Rabbi and says, well, if we are judging on voices here, you surely would be declared unfit to come up to the priestly podium. And Rabbi Shimon is so upset about this insult that he tells his dad, and his dad comes up with a real zinger. It turns out Rabbi Chia has a little Hebrew pronunciation problem of his own. He doesn't distinguish between the hey and the chet. So this makes a verse that actually says, I will wait for the Lord all my days, hikiti, into I will smite, hikiti, the Lord all my days. So, from a disability studies perspective, I find this shift very significant because it is really bringing home here the socially constructed nature of disability. Right? The way that anything, if you look at it right or wrong, can become a social liability, can become a disability. Right? As I read it, the Talmud's also almost farcical account of the insults thrown between these two rabbis and their fathers chronicles also the danger of the exclusion game. When insult, exclusion, and stigma reign, no one's place is entirely secure. But from a disability studies perspective, I think the most important part of this text comes near the end. The final portion of the passage, which consists of 3 cases where a category of priests is forbidden from blessing. In each case, the anonymous editorial voice of the Talmud argues against the prohibition. It says, no, it can't be right that so-and-so is, these kinds of priests are forbidden from blessing, because I know an example that counters the rule you just stated. So let's look at one of these examples in line 26. Rabbi Yochanan says, a man who is blind in one eye may not lift up his hands. But there was, now the anonymous voice protests, but there was a man like this in Rabbi Yochanan's neighborhood, and he spread his hands. So the text asks, why? And it gives the answer, because he was familiar in his town. In this case, and each of those that follows, the Talmud resolves the contradiction by affirming the general principle, but asserting that if a priest is known in a particular town, then he's permitted to bless, because he's well known. Because he's familiar, no observers will get caught in this misplaced gaze. They will not be tempted, right, to engage in that inappropriate act of looking, that act of staring and stigmatizing. So familiarity diffuses the stare. It's not here the disabled body that's problematic, it's the disabling gaze. Right? In this passage that we've examined from the Babylonian Talmud, familiarity then is positioned as a cultural solution to the problem of stigma. Traditional Jewish thinkers actually continue to use this principle of familiarity in a number of more modern rulings about whether disabled priests may bless. So Yosef Cairo, a 16th century author of a major law code that's still influential to this day, follows this principle of familiarity. He actually extends the concept and said, even a priest who's blind in both eyes may bless if he's familiar in his town. Not all modern authorities are as permissive, but most traditional sources teach that familiarity overwrites disability. According to an influential 20th century Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, an amputee, so a Kohen, a priest, who has a prosthetic leg, is welcome to come forward and bless, and unlike the other priests, he doesn't have to take off his shoes. Because the removal might be difficult for him, the sight of the prosthesis might distract the congregation, but because he's familiar in his place, it is no problem for him to perform the blessing. So this principle of familiarity, I think, has potentially far-reaching implications for how we think about disability and the integration of disability into religious communities, far beyond the particular case of Jewish priests performing the blessing. The principle is one of the ways that the Talmud allows practice, right, to overwrite what was otherwise a restrictive point of biblical law, and to open up more possibilities for for priests within communities. Yet as important as the principle of familiarity is, as positive as I think this principle might be, I also want to be clear about its limits. The principle of familiarity assumes that disability is de facto a problem. The problem becomes ameliorated only when a priest with a disability becomes, quote unquote, known in his place. In this passage, as I read it, the Talmud does shift the problem away from the priest himself, right, and emphasizes that the problem lies with those who are doing the staring. Right? Distraction then becomes the key problem, not disability. But this movement is subtle. It's always at the risk of being undone, of sort of bouncing back and implicating the body of the disabled man, the body of the person who causes the stare. So to glimpse something of this frailty of the Talmudic concern with the gaze, the uneasy implications of its concern, I want to take a look at texts that consider the intersection between disability and gender. Right? And here's a place where we can see, writ large, the idea that blemishes, right, mumim, are problems. Right? The Talmud here does less innovative things about the gaze and the problem with the stare. No, when we get to the situation where we're dealing with brides who have blemishes, the Talmud, written here in this case by male rabbis, is more conclusive about the fact that women's bodily blemishes pose an impediment to a successful marriage. Women's disability appears most prominently in rabbinic Jewish texts in the context of legal dilemmas over marriage negotiations. Right? So it happens when a man is in the process of negotiating the marriage contract for his bride. Okay? One of the things I want to do by looking at the intersection between disability and gender is emphasize that it's critical to think about disability not as a totalizing sole identity category, but think about the way disability intersects with and interacts with other aspects of a person's identity and social experience. Okay? In this case, we see that disability becomes very intertwined with gender, class, and sexuality. Okay? So, Looking at this intersection, the nexus between gender, sex, and disability, allows us to see a central tension in the rabbinic gender system and the ways these classical rabbis are thinking about gender. Right? In rabbinic culture, in classical 6th century rabbinic culture, a man hopes for a beautiful and dutiful wife. But the problem is, a good rabbinic man cannot be looking too closely at a prospective bride until after he has already sealed the deal. So this is a problem for him. Okay? A husband's knowledge is constrained, a husband's knowledge of the physical form of his bride's body is constrained by a very charged, sexualized boundary between his own realm and the world of women. Okay? He needs to know, he wants to know, but he cannot yet look. So, to think more about these texts, I want to just borrow a little snippet from the work of Eve Kosofsky-Sedgwick, who's a lesbian theorist who's written about the power of the gay and lesbian closet. Okay? And I want to take her concept of the closet and take it out and apply it here a little bit to disability studies thought, because I think it works to illuminate some of the way secrecy, shame, and stigma around bodies functions in these texts. Okay? The closet, right, the idea that some people are in the closet, some people come out of the closet arises in the gap between visible and invisible knowledges, in the space between secrecy and disclosure. The closet thematizes the intense charge that surrounds what we conceal and what we reveal, the threat or the promise of passing, the power and potency of hiding a dangerous sexual secret. There's a powerful closet, then, if I may use the metaphor, in the midst of the Talmud's discussion of marriage and disability. Rabbinic marriage texts idealize a fantasy of the unblemished female body in a way that creates, de facto, a powerful closet around women's actual bodily imperfections. And that rabbinic marriage closet is shaped around the tension between knowing or hiding the truth about a bride's potentially disabled body. So let's take a look now at what happens when disability surfaces in the middle of a rabbinic marriage. Okay? When a woman marries under rabbinic law, she receives a ketubah. A ketubah is a marriage contract that specifies the minimum payment that a husband owes her if he dies or if he divorces her. The ketubah is actually, I think, one of the most important benefits and securities that rabbinic law provides for women. So it's a major innovation. It's very important socially for protecting in a material way the rights and well-beings of women. Okay. In rabbinic practice, the husband alone holds the right of divorce, so only he can initiate divorce, and the ketubah provides a kind of protection that makes divorce less desirable, more expensive, and also protects a woman in the event of divorce. If a woman becomes disabled over the course of her marriage, right, in an ordinary way, in most cases, rabbinic law fully obligates her husband to care for her and to provide for her needs. Okay. Just want to make that clear. So what we're dealing with here, the only situation we're dealing with is actually a very uncommon situation. It's a situation, a problem that arises if a woman's blemishes are already existent before the marriage, but they get successfully concealed from the husband before he seals the deal, while he's negotiating the terms of her marriage contract. Okay. So rabbinic texts assume two things. They assume, first of all, that a man will not knowingly marry a disabled woman, and that a woman who has a disability and her father might collude together to conceal the presence of a blemish from her prospective husband. Okay. And the law acts to protect the husband in such a case. So if the husband can successfully show that the blemish predated the marriage, that it was concealed from him during the marriage negotiations, and that he didn't know he was marrying a woman with a disability, the bride can be divorced free of charge without her ketubah payment. Okay. So the central rabbinic text on disability in marriage is Mishnah Ketubot 7:7. This is on the back of your handout. Okay? And it discusses the legal rights of the husband if he finds his bride or his bride-to-be has blemishes. The legal machinations in this text are a little bit complicated, and they need not detain us here. Okay? I want to look at a phrase that appears near the end of the passage, line 33, which says, "The blemishes that disqualify priests disqualify women." So our Mishnah here makes a correspondence between that Leviticus passage, right, and the blemishes that invalidate or could invalidate a woman's marriage. But the rubric of priestly blemishes actually proves insufficient to cover all of the disabilities that a husband might discover in his bride. So in Ketubot 75a, this is on line 42 in your handout, the Babylonian Talmud, as it's discussing and expanding this Mishnah, adds 3 additional conditions that invalidate a marriage. It says another disability, a woman who sweats, presumably to excess, okay? A woman who has a mole or a mark, or a woman who has bad breath, right? It's possibly not good news for many of us in this room. The Talmud then launches an extended discussion of blemishes in women's bodies, which I've not put on your handout. And it turns out, so as we follow this discussion, that the rabbis also find scars from dog bites, harsh voices, wide-spaced breasts, over-large breasts, and a number of other conditions quite unbecoming in prospective wives. The Talmud's concept of female blemishes, this is a neat moment for me, include many visual characteristics. Right? They focus, when they're thinking about women's disability, they focus especially, not exclusively, but especially on physical features of a woman's body. Okay? By contrast, when it turns to husband's disabilities, which is, I'll say, a shorter section, okay, many of these disabilities center on unsavory smells. Okay, especially those that are generated by unsavory occupations. So it seems the rabbis imagine women as especially repulsed by the nose, while they figure men as particularly led by the desire of the eye. So once again here, we get a moment where we see how culturally constructed disability is, right? And how it's shaped by perceptions of desire, of sexuality, of what we find attractive, appealing, interesting about the body. Right? So when we take a look at Mishnah Ketubot 7:8, right, a text that's dealing especially with the question of whether the husband or the father has to supply proof about the origin of a woman's blemish, again, we don't need to get tangled up in this. I want to take a look at a passage in this Mishnah that refers primarily to the circumstances under which a husband can claim fraud. Okay? Much of this rests on the question of timing. In rabbinic culture, there's often a substantial amount of time that elapses between betrothal, okay, and the actual marriage. Okay? If a blemish arises after betrothal, it's tough luck for the husband. Okay? If the blemish arises before the betrothal, however, and it gets concealed during the negotiations, this is the situation in which the husband has a legal claim. He can say the marriage negotiation was, quote, a purchase made in error, that he was deceived and defrauded because the blemish was not disclosed. But this strategy, it turns out, may not work in every case. A husband can claim fraud only in the case of hidden blemishes. That's line 40. Now let's go back to Ketubot 75a, when the Talmud is talking about a particular blemish that it claims disables women but not priests, a mole. Okay? In line 43, the rabbis are trying to sort out what sort of mole exactly would disqualify a wife but not a priest. Hairy moles and large moles, it says, are problematic on both cases. Okay? Small moles, though, don't count as a blemish for either. They don't matter. They don't disable either a woman or a priest. So in line 46, Rabbi Yossi has to come up with a solution here. He proposes that the problematic bridal mole is small but striking in its placement. A mole that appears on a woman's forehead represents, in his view, a legally significant blemish. It is presumably a blemish because it is perceived to disfigure, because it is not beautiful. But in line 47, the anonymous voice challenges Yossi's claim. Right? If the mole were visible, then a prospective husband would clearly have seen it when he arranged the marriage. Remember, the whole point of this discussion is the bridal disability is only an issue when it constitutes fraud. If the husband can see the disability writ plain on her forehead, then he should have negotiated better at the start. So, in Rabbi Yossi's case, the forehead mole is a blemish because it's prominent. But if it's prominent, then the husband can hardly go back and claim that he was defrauded. So in line 48, Rav Papa presents a solution. He says, the mole in question was covered momentarily by a woman's hat, sometimes apparent, at other times concealed. Now this elusive mole, slipping in and out of sight, sometimes revealed, sometimes concealed, evokes for me another critical concept in disability studies. Right? This idea that disability is not a straightforward or securely visible category. The borderlines of disability are porous and permeable. Many disabilities are invisible. Bodies are always shifting and changing. They're aging. And our social conception of the norm, of what's beautiful, of what's acceptable, is also changing too. Most of us in this room, I suspect, would reject the idea that a mole constitutes a real disability. The mole, therefore, allows us to see the way in which there's often very little dysfunctional at all about disability. Disability is, in this case, a judgment of aesthetics, a rejection of a certain kind of body as distasteful, imperfect, and undesirable. While we likely disagree with the rabbis, the classical rabbis here, on the specifics of disability aesthetics, the nexus of disability, revulsion, and beauty standards remains a powerful force in contemporary culture. I've talked about these rabbinic texts in a variety of contexts. And for all the questions people ask about these texts, what's a ketubah? How does betrothal work? What are early Jewish conceptions of marriage? What did rabbis today think about moles? Not so much. No one has ever asked, why doesn't the suitor want a disabled bride? Disability as a negative identity marker is so ingrained in so many of our cultures that we often take for granted the idea that disability is a diminishment, a defect, something to avoid at all costs. So far, I've used this Talmudic passage to illuminate negative cultural links between disability and undesirability, to highlight how women's disability is structured in part through particular conceptions of sexuality, aesthetics, and desire that often objectify and diminish women's full personhood. But while there's a lot to dislike in this passage, I also want to lift up an element of this text and this discussion that I find powerful, provocative, and suggestive for the contemporary moment. It's back in Mishnah Ketubot 7:8, line 39. This text is outlining the situation of our prospective rabbinic husband and limiting his ability to claim deceit. The text says, he can only say he didn't know she was disabled if he lives in a city without a bathhouse. Why? The rabbis assume that a husband will be sending his own female relatives to examine the bride on his behalf, in what I find a delightfully unexpected twist, a little bit of a queer moment here in an otherwise very straight text. The Mishnah imagines a culture in which women are checking each other out in the bathhouse, right? In which women can know or can learn the details of one another's bodies and flesh. Since a husband cannot legally uncover his bride before their marriage, he has to send women in his stead. He comes to knowledge through another woman's gaze. Right? So I've always loved this moment in the text because it feels for me a subversive recognition that women's insight does matter. That even in a legal system, right, and a legal system that is set up primarily structured around men's thinking about women, what we need here, the rabbi's world in this case, depends in some small way on women's knowledge of each other. So in this moment, I want to suggest the Mishnah acknowledges the power and importance of the suppressed and subterranean voice. It acknowledges that the powerful, elite, legislative majority needs and depends on those who are often silenced. In the rabbinic text, in this text, the subterranean voice belongs to women. But in our context today, in this moment, with this gathered community, I want to suggest that it might also belong to people with disabilities, to the CRIP community, to those of us who are often in the pews but rarely on the bema or in the pulpit, to those of us who are often blessed but who rarely give the blessing, to those who are often prayed for but who rarely shape the terms and tenor of those prayers. It is not enough, I think, to speak about disability, to think of caring for people with disabilities. While benevolence is certainly always better than disgust, while inclusion is certainly better than scorn, the charitable impulse alone cannot fashion communities of justice and integrity. Religious communities need the insights that emerge out of disability experience. They need the voices, contributions, imaginings, and aspirations of people with disabilities. Religious communities, in my view, need the critical sensibility that comes from resisting ableism, from refusing the stare, from sloughing off stigma, from spitting out sentimentality and pity, from rejecting daily assaults of injustice and indignity, from claiming disability as a vibrant, powerful source of possibility and pride. So, I very much appreciate the rabbinic injunction to familiarize disability. But I also want, as I move forward from these texts, as I think about reading these texts forward into my own living tradition, I want a religious community that values disability also as difference. I want a place for disability in religious community that goes beyond inclusion, that actually actively invites disability, not just in a sanitized, normalized form. I want a community that is open to the strange, the unusual, the uncanny, that is excited about the unfamiliar. When I work in disability activist circles, we often talk together about what it might mean to fashion religious and spiritual communities that are on the front lines of the disability justice movement, that see a commitment to people with disabilities as an obligation that extends beyond the sanctuary into fair housing, right livelihood, good employment, equal access, that honors disability and affirms CRIP sensibilities in liturgy, theology, prayer, law, practice. For me, reclaiming theological imagination is a powerful resource for fashioning this kind of voice, for bringing disability into the speaking center of our respective traditions. These kind of readings can bring forth the insights that emerge out of actual inhabited, fleshy, complicated bodies and lives. So today I want to close by sharing a piece, an evocation of my own disability imagining, a disability theology that emerges in a Jewish key. On the morning of the Jewish holiday of Shavuot, it's customary to chant from the book of Ezekiel, reciting the Israelite prophet's striking image of God. In the opening verses of the book of Ezekiel, the last passage that's on your handout, the prophet, the biblical prophet, describes how, quote, the heavens opened and he saw visions of God. Visions of a radiant fire borne on a vast chariot, lifted up by 4 angelic creatures with fused legs, lustrous wings, and great wheels. The wheels, he said, gleamed like beryl. They were wheels within wheels, which could move in any direction, going wherever the Spirit called them to go. Quote, for he says, the spirit of the creatures was in the wheels. In Jewish tradition, Ezekiel's wild, uncanny vision has been the site of much mystical speculation over the centuries. In late antiquity, a group of Jewish mystics, who scholars call descenders to the chariot, left impassioned writings describing their experience of fasting and prayer, a process by which they eventually drew closer and closer to the divine throne and eventually came into the presence of the holy. For them, the wheels of Ezekiel's chariot formed God's, the wheels that Ezekiel saw formed part of God's chariot, the divine seat that bore God's glory through the heavens. Now, I'll confess, as a scholar, I'm fascinated by those texts and those ancient mystics. But I've never found Ezekiel's vision particularly revelatory for my own spirit. Until one recent Shavuot morning when Ezekiel's vision split open my own imagination. Hearing those verses chanted aloud, I felt a jolt of recognition, an intimate familiarity, a whimsical kind of imagined kinship. I thought, God has wheels. What a sizzling possibility. What this connection between the chariot and the wheelchair. When I think of God on wheels then, I imagine God sharing in some way in the delight I take in my own chair, the holy possibility that my own body knows, the way wheels set me free and open up my spirits. Perhaps, I think, perhaps God inhabits the particular fusions that mark a body in wheels, the way flesh flows into frame, into tire, into air. This is how the holy moves through me in the intricate interplay of muscle and spin, the exhilarating physicality of body and wheel, the rare promise of a wide open space, the unabashed exhilaration of a dance floor where wing and wheel can finally unfurl. On wheels, whenever I'm on wheels, I feel the tenor of the path deep in my sinews and my sit bones. I come to know the intimate geography of a place, not just the broad brushstrokes of terrain, but minute fluctuations in topography, the way the wheel flows. As all of us who regularly catch caster wheels in the crumble of unfortunate asphalt know, it isn't always smooth rolling out there. When I roll, I pay particular attention to the interstices, the intersections, the place where concrete seams together uneasily, the buckle of tree roots pushing up against asphalt, the bristle of crumbling brick. Perhaps this is how God pays attention. This bone-deep knowledge of every crack and fissure, this particular interest in junctions, in unexpected meetings, the points of encounter where two things come together. Imagining God in and through my wheels also puts a different spin on a critical religious issue. If God has wheels, perhaps she all too often has an access problem. How do we let God in? How do we make space for the wild, freewheeling spin of the chariot? How do we break down barriers of soul, the place where crusted architecture of the mind keeps the holy at bay? How might we all open the inaccessible spaces of our own hearts, our own minds? So as we continue the work of integrating disability more fully into religious community and religious practice, may we make space for a liberatory spirit, for insight that cracks open what has been stale and stayed within us. I wish us the blessing of the unexpected, the transformative encounter, courage and integrity in the pursuit of justice, and the gift of vibrant imagination and holy possibility. Kenya Hiratzon, may it be so. Thank you very much.